Formula One is a fairly elite club. Any given year, only 20 super talented drivers are given the chance to drive in the highest level. And at the same time, Formula One is a super expensive sport. The power unit alone costs nearly 10.5 million. This means that sometimes money takes precedent over talent, and teams hire drivers who can help foot the bill. And usually this makes people pretty upset. In this video, I want to take a look at the difference between talent drivers and paid drivers and break down their respective roles within the sport. A paid driver is someone who usually isn't paid by the team but is offered a seat in the team in exchange for the funding they bring, either from personal wealth or sponsorships. Often the first image of a paid driver that pops into people's head is the spoiled teenager who bought himself a seat with daddy's money, and paid drivers get a bad rep for taking valuable spots away from talented drivers. And this can certainly be the case sometimes, but not all paid drivers are that bad. For example, let's play a game of word association. I'll say a name and you say the first word that comes into your head. Ready? First, Mark Webber. Second, Michael Schumacher. Third, Niki Lauda. Fourth, Sergio Perez. Words like world champion, all-time greats, talented, or racing point might come into your mind, but you probably didn't say paid driver to any of them, yet all four started out in the sport as paid drivers. Webber has the notorious F1 scout Flavio Briatore and Australian sponsors Foster's and Telestra to thank for his seat at Minardi. Sure, Minardi in 2002 was what Williams is 20 years later, which is to say they had standing reservations for P19 and P20, but it was a seat nonetheless. Sergio Perez has made a name for himself over the past decade in F1 and has finally started to reap the benefits in Red Bull, but he probably wouldn't be in F1 if it weren't for the Mexican telecommunication company Telmex. And yes, even Niki Lauda and Michael Schumacher had to pay to get into the sport. Lauda took out several loans to back himself for F1's seat in 1972 and then proceeded to demolish the competition. Schumacher's talent managed to score him a Mercedes sponsorship, but not a seat in F1. So Mercedes, the car manufacturer, not the F1 team, ended up paying a hefty sum to get him a seat in Jordan in 1991, and the rest is, as they say, history. And in recent years, there's been quite a few paid drivers on the grid, besides just Perez, some of them more well known than others. Most known and perhaps most notorious is Nikita Mazepin, whose single season in F1 was scattered with scandals, the least of which was the fact that he was a paid driver. Although he had been a test driver for Force India since 2016, his F1 debut in Haas was made possible by a generous sponsorship from his father's company, Uralkali. A mediocre driver at best, it was clear to anyone with eyes that Mazepin's place was not in F1, but Haas really needed the money. If you look at the season Haas had with Mazepin's sponsorship money, just imagine what it would have been like without it. Maybe it's unfair to label Mazepin as mediocre at best, as many top drivers would also probably struggle to score points out of Haas's 2021 car. But it seems that the team has managed to get it together, so much so that Schumacher Jr. can turn in some very decent performances. But it's more likely that Mazepin just isn't good enough for F1. He showed some decent results in F3 and F2, and perhaps that's where he should have stayed. Another paid driver poster boy is of course Lance Stroll, and he is the classic story of what do you buy a man who already has everything? Well, apparently a seat in F1. Stroll's father Lawrence Stroll is a multi-billionaire who collects Ferraris, so spending some money to get his son a seat in Williams in 2017 and then in Racing Point in 2019 was probably a drop in the ocean for him. And by the way, I don't mean a seat in the team, I mean the whole team. Stroll's career in Formula One hasn't been the most celebrated, especially after the Force India rebrand to Racing Point and then later rebrand to Aston Martin. With the four-time world champion Sebastian Vettel as his teammate, Stroll was still the first driver in the team, although experience and success shouldn't have dictated otherwise. But what was Stroll Sr. supposed to do? Demote his own son? Yeah, not likely. That being said, Stroll's place in Formula One isn't undeserved. It's unlikely that he'll ever be the F1 championship or be in F1 without his daddy's money, but he's turned in some pretty decent finishes. In the 2020 season, he managed to finish in the points 10 times out of 17 races and bag 2 podiums. And while 2021 wasn't as good, he still managed to show some good results. Overall, Stroll isn't the worst driver on the grid, but he's not setting the racing world alight. Another paid driver on the current grid is Nicolas Latifi, and like Stroll and Mazepin, his reputation doesn't exactly benefit from it. Not many people know that he's in F1 by the grace of his daddy's wallet, but those who do will not hesitate to use the label against him. Having raced for Williams since 2020 in exchange for some much needed funding, he's currently dead last in the standings. Sure, driving a Williams isn't exactly conducive to collecting points, but he spent 2020 and 2021 being outperformed by George Russell and is currently playing second fiddle to Alex Albon, who has managed to score 3 whole points to Nicolas Latifi's 0. More a meme than a man at this point, Latifi definitely isn't F1 material. All of this being said, most if not all drivers have some form of personal sponsorship or financial backing. Carlos Sainz has Spanish beer manufacturer Estrella backing him, Charles Leclerc has watchmaker Richard Mille, Daniel Ricciardo has GoPro, and the list just goes on. As I mentioned, F1 is an insanely expensive sport, and there's a reason why the cars look like very fast billboards. In the absence of family wealth, the only alternative is to beg and borrow money from companies and patrons against promises of future greatness. 1996 world champion Damien Hill details his quest to afford driving in feeder series and later F1 in his autobiography Watching the Wheels. From cold calling companies to ask for sponsorships, to asking if his grandmother would be willing to sell her house to fund his career, to borrowing money from friends or friends of friends. His story is actually pretty sobering. To race in Formula 1 or any series for that matter, you need ambition and talent and drive, but most of all, you need money. It's worth mentioning that there is a difference between a paid driver and a pay driver. Some get and retain their seats because the team cannot afford to lose the funding they bring. For instance, Stroll might have been moved aside to make room for emerging talent coming from F2 if his dad didn't own the team. In contrast, some drivers start off as paid drivers but prove their talent and move on to better teams based on that. As I mentioned, Niki Lauda and Michael Schumacher started out as paid drivers and went on to win championships and redefine what being a Formula 1 driver means. Of the current grid, no one would accuse Perez of being an untalented driver undeserving of his place in the sport, yet he could also be considered a paid driver, at least at the beginning of his career. It's understandable that there might be some skepticism towards people who can easily afford a drive. Firstly, they may be in the way of more talented drivers who don't come with the extra funding for the team. And secondly, paid drivers rarely stack up against their more talented rivals and teammates. Anyone who does make it to F1 or even F2 is undoubtedly above the average driver, and the differences in machinery make it nearly impossible to compare drivers from different teams with any accuracy. Just look at George Russell. He earned a total of 18 points during his 3 years in Williams, and now 158 during half a season in Mercedes. But the fact that he made it to Mercedes is telling enough, as his former teammate Latifi only seems to be making such moves into walls. Comparing paid drivers to a teammate is the easiest and maybe the only way to assess their performance. Take for instance Russell-Latifi's partnership at Williams. Over the course of 2 seasons, Latifi managed to finish ahead of Russell only 11 times, and 6 of those races ended as a DNF for Russell. It's much the same this season. Latifi has managed to finish ahead of Albon only twice. And Lance Stroll hasn't fared much better against his much more experienced teammates Felipe Massa, Sergio Perez, and Sebastian Vettel. He finished 15th in the championship to Perez's 10th in 2019, 11th to Checo's 4th in 2020, and Stroll's fate hasn't changed all that much since Perez has departed to Red Bull, as now he's just stuck staring at the back of Vettel. It seems that Seb is determined to end his F1 career with a bang and currently has 4 times as many points as his teammates. This sounds pretty impressive until you find out that he has 16 points to Stroll's 4, but still 4 times as many. Actually, the only time Stroll was ahead of his teammate was in 2018 when he raced for Williams alongside other paid driver Sergei Sirotkin, who I should mention was quick to denounce the label despite having heavy backing from Russian SMP Bank. But what about Mazepin and his time in Haas? Well, similarly to Stroll and Latifi, he managed to finish ahead of his teammate Mick Schumacher only 4 times last year. But consider this, Stroll has had some very experienced drivers on the grid as his teammate. Meanwhile, Mazepin was against another rookie, albeit one with a famous racing family. On the flip side, whilst F1 is an expensive sport, you still need years and years of experience and results in feeder series to get your super license, and even karting isn't a cheap hobby. But F1 is astronomically expensive for the teams. Running an F1 team isn't just about building a fast car, it's hiring the right people, traveling from Grand Prix to Grand Prix almost weekly for half a year, and that's going to take some serious cash. And if you manage to build your car and get it on the track, sometimes your drivers will crash it, requiring hundreds of thousands of pounds in repairs. And sometimes you break a rule and you have to pay an eye-watering fine to the FIA. Not to mention that in order to attract sponsors, you need to spend money on development and hope that it pays off. It's no wonder that the days of privateer teams owned by former drivers are generally over, and the teams are increasingly owned by large corporations. As the joke goes, what is the easiest way to become a millionaire? Start off as a billionaire with an F1 team. With all of this in mind, pay drivers are a necessary evil in F1. Take Williams and Latifi for example. It's normal for F1 teams to move up and down in the standings during different eras. Current backmarkers like Williams used to be a dominant team in the 90s. Formed in 1997, Williams is one of the oldest and historically one of the most successful teams on the grid, but has just fallen on some hard times. It would be a shame to lose a team like that, and it's drivers like Latifi that help keep it afloat. Don't get me wrong though, Latifi still sucks. Williams is a good case study of the conversation surrounding pay drivers. In 2018, when their driver lineup consisted of Stroll and Sorokin, team boss Claire William both denied and defended using pay drivers, saying, "This is a dangerous business and we're not going to put someone in a car just because they come with money. Our decision-making process is much more complex than just deciding to put a driver in a racing car because they've got some cash." And then following that up with, "It's nothing new in Formula 1 that drivers come with money. Thank goodness, frankly, that they do. I think it's incredibly naive for anyone to make that statement to say he's just a paid driver. It's great if a driver has financial interest from partners. It's great for the team and it's great for the driver." Another good example is Haas. They took Mazepin's money, built a competitive car with it, and consequently, in Gunter Steinberg's words, they're not a bunch of wankers anymore. The decision to oust Kevin Magnussen and Romain Grosjean after the 2020 season and hire Mazepin and Schumacher for 2021 was met with many raised eyebrows, but Steiner has since admitted that the change in the lineup saved the team. "I had to find opportunities to keep the team going financially. Many families depended on it. There was no anger or dissatisfaction, it was just a business decision. The alternative is that we would not be here. People need to understand that. So if we kept Kevin but Haas did not survive, Kevin wouldn't have had a car to drive anyway." These quotes highlight the fact that paid driver is first and foremost an insult, yet most teams and spectators alike see them as an integral part of the sport. For the fans, the latter comes with a certain begrudging acceptance, but acceptance nevertheless. For the teams, it's all about crunching numbers and surviving for another season. And maybe we should all reconsider the insult too. Everyone wants to see good racing and talented drivers, and I don't want to repeat myself, but Formula 1 is incredibly expensive. If buying a seat helps save a team or introduce us to great drivers, then we shouldn't shame drivers for using the resources that are available to them. We should stick to shaming drivers who are bad at racing, like Mazepin. But that's my thoughts on paid drivers and talent drivers. What do you think? Are they a necessary evil or are they ruining the sport? Let me know in the comments down below.